Thank you very much. My name is Macharia Munene. I'm Professor of History and International Relations at the United States International University in Nairobi. History is dynamic. It is through history that people get to know themselves, their character, and to develop ability to strategize and safeguard their interests. If people do not know their history, their background, the forces that have shaped them, they then tend to be shaped by other people. And the essence of being human is to perpetuate yourself and your kind, your interest, and not to perpetuate some other groups or interests at the expense of your own. Imperialism and colonialism are conquests. One people beating up on another people and imposing their ways of lives, of thinking, of doing anything, then only then do they feel happy. And they can talk about their empire. And that means that they have made other people believe in their own superiority. And that the right way to do things anytime is to do it the way of the conqueror. So colonialism was an exercise in imperial conquest. And to do that effectively, there were three instruments that were used. You had the soldiers with their guns and whatever else they did to beat people into submission. Then you had the administrators. Sometimes the soldiers became the administrators. And the administrator's job was to govern the conquered people in the way with the foreign rules and new laws that serve the interests of the conqueror, that is the colonial state. The third instrument were the missionaries. Their job was to soften the conquered, in this case the African, called the native. Once he's softened, he is then manipulable, and he can be acculturated into the ways of the conqueror. So, and to do that, the missionary had to convince the African, the conquered person, that everything about him is evil. Everything about him is devilish. Because the only true way is the way of the conqueror. When the white powers met at Berlin in 1884 and 85, and their purpose was to agree on how to claim territories in Africa without killing each other in Africa. That was the purpose. And they agreed on the rules that you go to a place, if there's a flag of a white power, you know it's taken. So go somewhere else, if it's not there, plant your flag and let everybody know. And then it's yours. But then to prove that it's yours, you have to have effective occupation. Effective occupation meant beating up people into submission. That's where the soldiers come in. And then once they are beaten, you have administrators, and then the missionaries to soften them. Now, the three of them working together were very effective. Let's say in Kenya, what became Kenya? Because by 1914, virtually every segment or section of Kenya, then the people in it had been beaten into submission. And they are beginning to imbibe the ways of the white man.
Chapter 9, Central Africa, Evidence from a... Chapter 9, Central Africa, Evidence from a Small State, the Kingdom of Kuba. We must not lose sight of what we are doing, the important points of what we have been doing. A partial view of the early history of the blacks, from the loss of their Egyptian homeland to the coming of the Europeans, has been presented through a summary study of a representative number of states, a continent-wide view of what happened to the whole by looking at typical situations. A people forever migrating, forever on the move, forever in flight from the threats of survival. A new location found, sites of relief and thanksgiving for a new breathing spell, and new efforts at reunification and state building all over again. But every decade of unsettled life, every decade of wandering over deserts, savannas, and through forest, every such decade was one of retrogression and disintegration, decades of decline. And no newly established state was able to reach the levels of achievements of the past before it was engulfed either by the Islamic East or the Christian West. This is what we have witnessed. No matter what black states was studied or in the region of Africa it was located. One of those wandering groups, unlike the Congolese and Angolans, began to migrate from the Atlantic seaboard before the whites arrived, was free from contacts with them much longer, and therefore founded a new nation that lasted much longer. The core group was made up of blacks who became known as the Bushongs. They were moving from place to place toward the interior and finally began to develop from the new state during the period when the white storm clouds were slowly rising in all directions. The 200 years between 1475 and 1675. Check the dates. The most critical in the history of blacks. It was during this period that the great noose of encirclement was completed and fixed, and the blacks of Africa found themselves hemmed in and threatened from all directions, from the north, from the east, from the west, and finally from the south. The white man's march toward world conquest and world domination was in full swing. This most critical period in the history of the race, I say, was such because this closing in on the blacks from all directions was the beginning of the final death blows to what remained of their own civilization. There were dire consequences in terms of their psychological impact on Africans under perpetual danger. A new fatalism emerged that carried the sentence of ultimate doom to the minds of thousands. Some gave up resistance to anything, including a resistance to slavery and resistance to barbarism that engulfed those who either went backwards or stood still for mental atrophy. Some tried to save themselves by serving the invaders, because even if it meant enslaving or killing their own people, some believed that because the white man came in big ships with big earth-shaking guns, surely they must be gods of the world. Others saw no sense in trying to maintain the traditional brotherhood and attempts at unity in the face of such overwhelming odds. Rather, the drive must be to secure the guns and ammunition from the whites, even if it meant ceaseless wars to secure the slaves the white demanded, secure them by warring on their own kinsmen in neighboring territories. And still others resolved never to yield, to move and keep on moving rather than to submit, to rebuild and keep rebuilding, never giving up, and to fight for unity as the only route to survival. Voluntary unity, if possible. Unity by force, if all else failed. These last others were the ones who had the spirit that accounts for the survival of the most bruised and battered of the races of mankind. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Chancellor Williams's book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Chapter 9, Central Africa, Evidence from a Small State. And if we're taking account to what I was just reading in the video that played in the beginning, we're talking about domination, control, how to take over another group of people. Arms, politics, and religion. That's what we're talking about today. Arms, politics, and religion. 3 tools outsiders used to destroy Black civilizations. But we're also going to talk about how African people played a part in the enslavement of other African people. And see, that's a reality that we have to come to grips with, right? Because we had a number of African people who were good, and we had a number of African people who were not good. And the number of those African people who were not good, they submitted to white supremacy. As you can see, I was reading earlier, they wanted to secure the slaves for the whites and be involved in the slave trading with the whites, like Tipu Tip, right? So we find out that slave trading of Africans by Africans did happen on the continent of Africa. But it still all goes back to the transatlantic slave trade that was happening, right? Because if it wasn't for the transatlantic slave trade, those slaves or prisoners of war would have been sold to another group of African people who would have treated them like human beings. And they would have served for a while and then to servitude and when been able to go back to their life. Their whole lives would not have been uprooted and taken from them the same way it was in the transatlantic slave trade. So there are differences. Now, I'm not saying that to excuse the behavior of those Africans, because those Africans are sellouts and they need to be called out. They need to be recognized as sellouts. There are a lot of William O'Neills out there. What we're finding out is the sellout Black is not new. It's not an American invention. Sellout Blacks have always existed. We've been reading this. We've been reading about this whole book. It's always talked about a group of Black people who supported the oppressors. Arms, politics, religion. Use the arms to take them over. Use the politics and religion to soften them up. The missionaries come in under the guise of God and bringing peace, bringing you a new worldview, a new God, because my God is greater than your God, and I can show you what my God can do. And then bring in the politics and get involved in the local politics of the people that they're looking to conquer. Remember, this is a slow process. This process could last 20 to 30 years. The taking over by the missionaries and the political upheaval. And then the guns come in. And when the guns come in, it's all over, because as the gentleman said in the beginning, the politics and the religion have softened them up, and now they're ready to be conquered. So sit back, relax, put your seatbelts on. Remember to like this video, comment, subscribe, share, like, man. Y'all hit that like button. Please hit that like button and get in those comments. That's how we help these videos be seen by more people. That's how we help the channel continue to grow. Remember, the growth of this channel is just not about me. It's about the community that I am serving, my Tallahassee community. And I want to be able, I want to be able to serve as many other communities as possible. Many people have asked me about streaming my online classes. Right now, I just need more resources to be able to stream my online classes. And not only that, to be able to reach more children. On the Shoulders of Giants is something that I built to reach as many people as possible. So I need your help by liking this video, comment, subscribing, hitting that support me on Patreon. There's a Cash App. You can hit the super like button under the video. All the different ways to support on the Shoulders of Giants, support the children that I pour into. So I appreciate all of you. Help a brother out. So let's jump back into it. Page 238, this first paragraph. Such a representative groups were the Bushongs. Their record will show. As the Portuguese slave raid spread, the Bushongs moved inland from the Atlantic, enlisting new followers as they moved or temporarily stopped. They were headed towards the Congo region. Fleeing from the whites was not the only problem for them, as it was not the only problem for millions who had trampled over Africa before them. So when they had settled in the lower Kawango early in the 16th century, their immediate foes were the fierce Jaga warriors, a roaming tribe that seemed to be more interested in raids of destruction than in settling anywhere. They were destroyers, not builders, and they were set on a course to prevent others from settling and building. And while large groups of them did split off from the main body to merge with others and form states, they seemed to be nothing more nor less than bloodthirsty barbarians who engaged in warfare for the sheer thrill of warfare. These eventually opened war against the Bushong state that was forming over a wide area along the Kawango. Under relentless and savage attacks by the Jaga warriors, the Bushongs were forced to retreat along the Kasai and Sanguru rivers, many groups splitting off from the main body and going in different directions. The main body, led by its chief, Woot, entered the plain of Layul in Kasai and began the formation of a little-known state during the third quarter of the 16th century. It is precisely because it was small and generally unheard of that I selected it for a summary today. There was another reason. It was typical of hundreds of other small black states, which, unlike the world-renowned Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, the migrating blacks had built all over Africa, but what seemed to be so significant to the conquering Europeans that they were swept away, their people scattered with no vanishings to seek out the oral historians to hear how things came to be. What was achieved or failed to be achieved before death came to their society at last. The little kingdom of Kuba, then having its history recaptured, will be telling their story also, telling it substantially as it was in all fundamental particulars. The Bushong, or Central Organizing Group, was allied in a federation of voluntary kindred groups and other tribes, numbering 18 at the outset. The Kwa, the Kete, were indigenous. The Kwa, as previously stated, having lived there since the world began, and the Kwa, also known as the Twa, or the pygmies of the Twa and Mbuti. So these are the people who are also derogatorily referred to as the pygmies. So when I'm talking about the Kwa, I'm going to use the name the Kwa or Twa. I'm not going to use the name pygmy, but I just want y'all to know who I'm talking about. They offered no opposition to the invaders, seemed to welcome them, and became members of the Federal Union under Woot as the elected king. Many of them splintered off segments from the central groups, came in later from different directions to join the federation. Other members were the Mungo, Pinde, Ilebo, Shua, Kela, Kam, Kayilwing, Lulua, Luba, Ngere, Maluk, Payang, Ngombe, Biyang, Kufa, and Mbingi and Ngongo. From the beginning, the core group of the Bushong set an example for the nation building for all Africa, but few African states ever followed it. First of all, the total population at the formation of the Federal Kingdom can be estimated between 75,000 and 100,000, of which number the Bushongs were 80%. All the other tribes combined, therefore, were only 1/5 of the total population. This means that even under the most liberal democratic systems, the Bushongs could have dominated and ruled all the other tribes by the sheer weight and power of overwhelming numbers. They did not choose to do so. Here was what might be considered to be a justifiable occasion to depart from the traditional African constitution with all its embracing democratic system. Quite to the contrary, they followed it to the letter by simply transforming the village council of elders into a council of state in which each tribe, now constituting a constituent province, was represented as an equal by its own chief or representative of its choice. The members of the state council were the electors who chose the king. It was throughout Africa. The council represented the people, and therefore all powers not delegated resisted with the council. The significance of this was that the smallest tribe or province, which might be only 2% of the population, was equal to the council of the Bushong group. That was 80% of the population. A situation which head counters might criticize as the very antithesis of democracy. So now we're getting introduced to the kingdom of Kuba, which was founded by the Bushong. And then the Bushong merged with various other groups of African tribes and formed the kingdom of Kuba. And remember the pattern that Chancellor Williams is giving us when he's telling us about all these different empires and kingdoms, right? They follow the traditional African code of conduct, the Brotherhood African Code of Conduct. the African people had a code of conduct. Whenever they followed the code of conduct, things went good for them. When they deviated from the code of conduct, that meant their destruction, because you cannot be destroyed on the outside until you destroy yourself on the inside. And those African kingdoms destroyed themselves on the inside when they deviated from that African code of conduct. We, Black people in America right now, don't follow a unified code of conduct. So we're in disarray. So we can always be conquered. Think about it. But the numerically dominant Bushong seem to have been statesmen with a larger view of what democracy means if it was to operate as a unifying force with the divergent and formerly independent groups. What they did in effect was to make a frontal attack on tribalism, not by futile denunciations or exhortations, but by actually detribalizing themselves, first of all. They not only treated all of the different language groups as equals, but they promoted the national policy of glorifying those cultural variations in any groups which were so outstanding that they should be adopted nationally. Hence, the very tribe that in isolation had developed something noteworthy, but peculiar to itself, no matter how strange or different from all the others, could see its unique cultural pattern become a national institution and be filled with both pride and gratitude. If the Pende had a different kind of dance and excelled with it, theirs would become the national dance of Kuba. If the Luba excelled in architectural arts, they would be the leading planners and builders, and so on in all human endeavors. Each group could win national distinction in one way or another for excellence in one or more fields, including agricultural and cattle breeding. So we're talking about following that code of conduct and making sure that each group is equally or properly represented in the kingdom, because this is not about domination. It is about working together as one. If you're going to bring these other tribes into the empire and you want the empire to be strong and grow and sustain itself over a long period of time, everybody has to work on one accord, no matter what percentage of the population you are, which is totally different from over here in America. It's competition over here in America. And that we don't get. And that's why we don't operate as a group, because we don't understand the competition and the war that's going on in America. But in the kingdom of Kuba and all these other kingdoms that we read about, when they were following the code of conduct, brotherhood and true equality and equity reigned through those empires. The kingdom was south of Zambia in northern Katanga, over the province of Kasai between the Sankuru and Kasai rivers. There were 5 rulers during the short period of 19 years between 1568 and 1587, one being a woman. It was not known whether the council sitting as an electoral college set what seems to indicate 4-year terms. After 1587, longer but still fixed terms for kings or queens also seem to be indicated. It appears that these limited terms of office by kings continued during the supremacy for the council. For a long time, 10 years in office seemed to be the limit. This brings us to a third reason for selecting Kuba as both a sample and example state. Kuba shows how the blacks themselves do undermine and destroy some of their own best institutions and replace black democracy with black autocracy without the slightest external influence or aid whatsoever. What is more and often overlooked, a king may become a despot by the will of the people. This development, incidentally, is further justification of my rejection of 2 equally false doctrines. One is the contention of whites that the great institutions of Africa were Caucasian in origin, and the other is the contention that that the great African institutions were destroyed by Caucasians and other outsiders and not by them alone. What it all means is that the African people act and react just as all other people do, with the same motivations, conditions, or similar circumstances, aims, and objectives. Correct. We're learning true history. We're learning that African people are human beings just like any other people. We have our upside downs, our good, our bad, our left, our right, our hot, our cold, right? But another main point that Chancellor Williams is getting at is these African institutions built themselves and internally destroyed themselves before any outsiders was ever able to destroy them. These African institutions were autonomous. These African institutions were prosperous as long as they followed the African code of conduct. The political organization of Kuba, right? The political structure actually began with the family council or the clan council. That's a theme. That seemed to be a continued theme throughout all of these empires. The family council, family first, family is important. The political structure actually began with the family council or the clan council, which is the basic social unit of kinsmen. During the formative period of the state, each clan had its own village. As new immigrants swelled villages into towns and cities, these became divided into clan sections or wards. Each ward sent its elder as a representative to the village, town, or city council, over which presided the village headman, town sub-chief, or city chief. These chiefs in turn served as representatives in their areas on the province council, over which the paramount chief of the whole tribe presided. The paramount chiefs of the central provinces or states, the origin of 18 founders, represented their provinces, in the central state council over the elected king of Kuba presided. Conquered states and tribes, which came after the federal union was formed, were not eligible for representation on the state council, and their chiefs therefore could not participate in the election of kings. There were other special benefits and privileges enjoyed by the 18th electoral chiefs, with which other chiefs did not have, or more pointedly, the newcomers had burdens and responsibilities from which the electors, chiefs, were free. The heaviest of these were the tributary taxes levied on all chiefs except the original 18. This too was to cause trouble later. And now I'm going to read to you the governmental structure of the Kingdom of Kuba. So first, number one was the Council of State. And under 1A was the king presiding. 1B was the linguist or the interpreter and the special aid to the king. 1C was the chief of chiefs, which is the prime minister. The title of chief of chiefs actually is that of the king. Here it means to say to all the chiefs of Kuba. When you see and speak to my chief minister, you see and speak to the king. 1D is the governors of provinces or paramount chiefs. Each paramount chief or one of his elected generals was the supreme command of all military forces in his province. The king, who also a governor of his particular tribal province, had only the soldiers of his province under his command. Now, number two, the administrators, not members of the state council. 2A is the first chief of the treasury. 2B is the chief of border defense. 2C is supervisor general of tax collection, goods and services. 2D is chief of king's household and protector of ancestral tombs and regalia. 2E is chief of roads and markets, and 2F is collector general of tributary states. This office was created to wake the Mbong and Ling's imperialist expansion in 1650. So we're talking about governmental structures, political structures that were set in place before any European really got into their kingdom. Now, that doesn't mean that Europeans were not in the continent of Africa, but they had not affected the Kingdom of Kuba. But through our readings, we've seen that all of these empires we've read about had governmental structures and political structures and social structures and religious structures and all type of societal structures before any white man showed up. Because they like to tell us that white men gave us civilization, but civilization was already in place and thriving before any white man showed up. The founder or founders of a nation constitute the specially honored group throughout Africa and is the source of royalty itself. So Kuba was still following the African constitution when it made the central or nuclear group of 18 founders the permanent ruling council, to the exclusion of strangers. Yet it is equally clear that the newcomers increased the population as the nation expanded by conquering neighboring societies. The reason for future conflicts were also being expanded. These reasons noted here in Kuba were Africa-wide and account for the internal conflicts in the new African states today, even though all discontent has not come to the surface. And as in the case of Kuba, The trouble stems from the failure to include every segment of the population in a national program of absolute equality and the opportunity to participate so fully in every phase of the national life, that a sense of patriotism and belonging to the nation will gradually outweigh that of the belonging of a tribe. In short, what we so depreciatingly call tribalism is in fact the necessary cohesive and social mechanism for survival and defense against threats to survival. The tribe is the unit through which the race itself has survived during all of its migrating and scattering circumstances. The enemies that beset it were black as well as white. This is the tribes of today. This is the tribes of today know as well as their black brothers outside of the circle of 18 knew 400 years ago in Kuba. Tribalism will disappear only when the reasons for its existence in the first place disappear. Right. Tribalism, survival, running into enemies that look like you and enemies that may not look like you, enemies that kind of look like you, right? Remember, before the whites and the Asians showed up, the black people's enemies were their own people. So black people's original enemies were black people as far as interior in the continent of Africa. Outside of the continent of Africa, we have the Asians and then the Europeans. The Asians, the Arabs, the Europeans, the Persians, all these different groups, right? But within the continent, so tribalism, like any other group, any other race, on any other continent, any other tribes of people. Remember, the Native Americans here in North America and North Central and South America, the native groups that were here, the indigenous groups, their enemies were their own other indigenous groups to the land before the Europeans showed up. That's just history. That's just the fact. That's just mankind. The most noteworthy thing about Kuba in this connection, however, was that despite the disorganizing factor just mentioned, its original program of uniting many language groups into one nation was so successful that it had not been equaled by any nation in modern Africa. For look what actually happened. Many tribes, including the Bushong groups, merged so completely that they lost their individual tribal identity and language and became one people speaking one language derived from all others, the Bakuba and the people of Kuba. The e pluribus unum process that went on continuously all over Africa is what makes the work of ethnologists and linguists so baffling, and their dogmatic conclusions often misleading, imprecise, and sometimes simply false. Splitting off from the major into a dozen smaller groups, each developing a different language or dialect, then the remerger of any 12 splintered groups into another major group, forming once again one people and one language out of many, and so on until the next segmentation of many, and the later reformation of the many into a society and language group again. It is therefore unlikely, to put it modestly, that any anthropologist or linguist on Africa could take a group of Bakuba today and determine which had ancestors who were Bushong under Queen Ngokede, or Payang when Leshang Mbal was king, or Ngede when Mbo Mbush reigned from 1680 to 1695. I might have messed some of them names up, but I'm trying my best. Even members of a group as distinctive as the Kwa lost their identity through intermarriages with almost all the other groups. Their mingling with other groups was more widespread because, unlike them, they did not occupy a particular province, but were scattered in all of them. The descendants of a Kwamaluk marriage and King Mishematun's day, which was in 1620, could not be described as having pygmoid features today, or Maluk either. The reason is simple. There have been too many other crossings and recrossings during the 300 or 400 years that have passed. So he's getting at when anthropologists try to go back and try to pinpoint and identify specifically who these groups of people are. Chancellor Williams's argument is that you can't accurately identify who they are the same way Europeans would identify themselves because of the intermixing that has happened over the centuries and over the decades. When these groups of people came together to form new nations and new empires, they intermixed, and they intermixed their genetics and their culture and their languages. their ways of living. So what type of religion did they have in the kingdom of Kuba? There was no problem of religious unity in Cuba because there was no problem of religious conflicts in traditional Africa. The blacks, having a common origin and a common center of civilization, had the same fundamental religious beliefs throughout the continent, just as all of their other basic institutions were similar. The inevitable variations were insignificant when compared with the universal similarities. The Cubans believed, as all Africans believe, in one almighty God, the creator of the universe. There were numerous ways of expressing the one God concept. He might be identified with the sun and called the sun god, or as a variation of this, he might be called the sky god. The numerous other gods, far from being in conflict with the great God, were a necessary part of his divine plan. His own deputies and emissaries who had direct charge of the various departments of life that concern human needs, the earth, the soil, the water, illnesses, health, fertility, planting, harvest, the forest, war, hunting, fishing, rain, etc., right? There were lesser gods under these. Their rank or importance was determined by their role and the extent of their role. Different tribes might have different tribal gods, or a group of kindred tribes might have the same sub-gods. Each family or clan might or might not have its own clan god. Each member of the family might or might not have his own personal god. In short, the traditional African religion respected an almighty God and a hierarchy of lesser deities that were later taken over by Christianity in the form of patron saints and higher deities who ranked next to God himself, right? It is said that religion in Cuba did not include ancestral worship. This ancestral worship thing is another one of those overdone myths about Africans. The Bakuba did not worship their ancestors, but neither did other Africans, if Western writers are using the term in the sense that one worshiped God. And of course, they are using worship in this sense, just as they pretend to not understand the role of the numerous African deities, but understand the role of these same deities in Western civilizations, if we call them patron saints, in the same way as just about every other aspect of human life and history has been misrepresented and distorted. And that's what happens when others tell your story. So he's saying that there was ancestor reverence, not ancestor worship. This reverence for elders began in early life with the living and increased with the dead. When food was periodically placed at the graves, nobody expected the ancestral spirits to eat it. Like, actually, what they were doing was a demonstration that the communal spirit of sharing was being maintained. Furthermore, if the ancestors approved of their behavior, they were in a position to intercede on their behalf with the deities in times of crisis. So they didn't actually worship the ancestors. They venerated the ancestors, and it was more like a ceremonial practice to still give reverence and give acknowledgement to the presence of their ancestors and their ancestors' proximity to what they believe God was and where they believe God was. Kind of like that movie. Remember the movie Coco, the Disney movie Coco, when whenever the ancestors were no longer remembered, they would disappear, right? But that comes from Africa. The black conception of God was on a scale too grand to be acceptable in Western minds. So they had to reduce it by using a term that was equated to paganism, primitive, backwards, and barbarism. The word is animism. But the historian and anthropologist are witnesses against themselves, still proving the very opposite of what they intend. In documenting animism as the chief characteristic of the religion of the blacks from remotest times, they were also documenting the fact that the blacks' belief in the existence as well as the nature of one universal God also goes back to times immortal. Telling on themselves. When you let people talk long enough, they tell on themselves, right? And what is animism? As applied to the Africans, as it is the belief that the spirit or the creator of the universe or the universal God permeates all of his creations, living and dead, that God exists in everything living or dead. Therefore, any object, animate or inanimate, may be sacred. This concept of God and his creations would be regarded highly civilized if expressed by a Westerner in Suncep's terms as a reverence for life. Indeed, precisely the same African religious belief becomes the doctrine of immanence in Christian civilization. The Bakuba means people of Kuba. The Bakuba believed that two contending spirits affected man, the spirit of good and the spirit of evil. Evil was thought to be expressed most clearly in witchcraft, which in turn characterized persons engaged in the practice of trying to do harm to others. In Cuba, as throughout Africa, the penalty for witchcraft was either death or banishment. The much misrepresented witch doctor, far from engaging in the practice himself, had the task of combating the practice by trying to help its victims. Hence the title witch doctor, which came to be applied to all African doctors indiscriminately, became of the widespread belief that almost all human ills resulted from the work of evil spirits through the evil approaches, through the evil operations of witches, right? And so he goes on to further say that a long chapter could be devoted to the training of the native doctors and their practice of medicine. And I'm going to read this part, and I want to say this before I read this part, because the idea of the witch doctor is just some kind of pseudo practice that just comes out of the bush and say, hey, I have these cures for you. I have this medicine for you. Because he's going to later talk about the oral historian, but the witch doctor is the same. You can't just pop up one day and talk about you're a witch doctor. There has to be some kind of training that goes to it, right? But a long chapter could be devoted to the training of the native doctors in their practice of medicine. This is not our purpose at this point, but it should be noted in passing that writers have generally focused their attention on the entirely superficial externals that distinguish the African doctor's real practice of the healing arts. They spent years in the forest studying the medicinal properties of the various plants and herbs. They went through the same long periods of apprenticeship that the members of all other skilled crafts go through under a master. The people were not fools. The prescribed medicine had to be beneficial. If not, the doctor was held to an account far more rigidly than doctors are in our times. The African doctor's entire future in this community depended upon the successful ministrations, and these must overshow inevitable failures now and then. And while the psychological rituals of hideous mask to frighten off evil spirits, the wild dance of mystical speech were all intended to impress the people with the mysteries of healing, carried over to modern medicine and Latin prescriptions. After all of this, the native physician still had to produce satisfactory results or be disgraced. You can't just pop up and be a doctor. That's what he's getting at. You can't just pop up and be a doctor. People were not foolish. They were not dumb. Can't just say stuff. Nowadays, with all this information, you could just say stuff and people believe you. But back then, you can't just say stuff, right? Religion was involved in the practice of medicine as religion was involved in every aspect of African life. Disease was believed to be the result of some misdeed on the part of the individual himself or the working of an evil spirit. If widespread, the community as a whole might have sinned, either by commission or omission of something that offended either the deities or the ever-watchful ancestors. Songs, dances, and sacrifices were the communal activities designed to reestablish the proper relationship between the people and the unseen powers. Now we get into the history and the philosophy that is shared by the Bakuba. Each Cuban tribe was responsible for his own history, and the state was responsible for the history of the nation. It was oral history. The oral historian, again, that's the case of all other crafts, was a trained historian, right? His basic training was in I messed this word up, but mnemotechnical system. This training and memorizing began as an apprentice to a recognized historian other than the principal oral historian. There were special occasions for members of the clan to assemble to listen to the story of the clan, and another occasion for the general community to assemble for the overall history of the nation. The absence of written history made the task of oral history very exciting. He was generally held so strictly accountable for any errors made in his account, that at times the reaction to mistakes made seems to have been unreasonable. For while he was allowed the widest latitude in commentaries of his own, and even in fantastic embellishments designed to shock his listeners or entertain them, he dared not err in reciting the factual data of history. It seems quite clear that not only the elders, who were also well versed in oral tradition, knew the difference between the mystical and the truly historical account, but the people who understood what was intended as amusement and what was their real history. Aside from tall tales, the historian often used proverbs reflecting the philosophy of great leaders and that of a race, praise songs of great men and great events, songs in which would call the blues, which told the past failures and heartaches, and dances of victories won and of thanksgiving. So there was a version of the blues even in the kingdom of Kuba. It's our roots go deep. Our roots go deep, right? But the assembled elders always keeping a sharp watch out for any serious errors on the part of the oral historian. He might be removed or even banished. In either case, his career would be ended in disgrace, and this disgrace might wreck his life among his people. On the other hand, if successful, the rewards were great because the oral historian was the community's storehouse of wisdom and one of the most honored personalities. He was the core of the education system. The lineage was key to the history of the extended family, the tribe, and the nation. Within the lineage were the social, religious, economic, and political ties that held together the family, tribe, and nation. So you can't just pop up talking about you a doctor. You can't just pop up talking about you a historian. You had to be trained, learned, be an apprentice, and be respected. Now let's get further into some of this Cuban history and learn about some of these people who made a great impact on Cuban history. And we're going to start with somebody named Shyaam the Great. Shyaam the First was one of the greatest leaders of the Black race ever produced, and considering the conditions and circumstances of his time, I think he was the greatest. He became the king of Cuba in 1630. And during the relatively short period of 10 years, he set in motion an economic revolution that transformed the nation and gave it a new forward direction. He was not only far ahead of his own time in perceiving that economic development was the only way to restore the ancient greatness of the Blacks, but he is still ahead of the whole Black world today in the revival of economic activities on all possible fronts. The economy had remained on the subsistence level, right? So he was able to get the economy going. He was able to raise the economy up to get it going to a subsistence level, where at least we can maintain ourselves and we can eat and we can start to grow. We can set a base that we can grow from. Then Shyam's economic revolution stimulated many factors of the national resistance about which we know very little. For the revolution of 1630 was a revolution in thinking and a search for the new and better ways of doing things. The new king was interested in new styles and a break from the traditional art forms. His drive was for national consolidation and internal development rather than the wars of conquest that so much occupied the time and energies of his predecessors. The slowly developing economy now experienced a sense of urgency and national direction. New crops were introduced. Sorghum, corn, millet, not entirely new to the area, tobacco, yams, and beans. The external influence here was Black external influence, and now hardly external to Cuba, because some of the tribes now constituting the nation came from areas where these crops were grown. Could yams and tobacco grow in Cuba? Let's find out. Shyaam seemed to have been saying on all fronts, all down the line. The skilled crafts were expanded and methods of production improved and sped up by new techniques. New weaving and embroidery methods were notable. The break in tradition was most clearly seen in experiments in new art patterns and new styles of wood carving. All this economic activity meant a marked transition from a subsistence to a surplus economy. So the economy is growing. And this, of course, led to general prosperity through the expansion of markets and foreign trade. Since Cuba was not within the orbit of the caravan routes of international commerce. Her foreign trade was with other African areas. Cuban trade missions were sent near and far to promote trade through the establishment of markets had important trading centers in nearby and distant states. This was the most important aspect of Shyam's economic revolution, right? The general prosperity engendered by the economic revolution did not bring general internal peace. The inevitable increase in population was further expanded by the annexation of new territories, the influx of endless strings of migrating people who were attracted to this new land of opportunity. But they were strangers, and this fact, as noted above, was a cause of general unrest among them and even greater unrest among the conquered groups. It appears that the national prosperity served to heighten the tensions rather than reduce them. More trouble came from being elements in the country, members of a major tribe that had challenged the Bushung leadership even before the move from Laul. Rebellions also broke out just before Shyaam assumed the leadership. The Payang and Kete succeeded in capturing and destroying the capital city, while the unsubdued Bayang continued their attacks from the areas still under their control. These internal conflicts were of great historical importance because of the far-reaching consequences. The most important overall outcome was radical changes in the traditional constitution. To begin with, religion was drawn upon as an indirect means of social control by enhancing the divine role of the king. The traditional role of the king as the chief elder and therefore the chief representative of the people before God was very easily changed now to the concept of the king as the lieutenant God on earth. As God's lieutenant on earth, the king could assume powers not recognized by the Constitution and go unchallenged, deviating away from the codes of conduct. But above and beyond this, the internal turmoil was regarded as such a threat to the nation's existence by the loyal chiefs and the people that even more powers to the king had dared to assume were bestowed upon him to enable him to crush rebellions by direct action and restore internal peace. Here then is now a democracy may become an absolute monarchy, not by a coup d'etat, but by the consent of the people themselves. They seem to be thinking only about the others, the strangers causing trouble, when they allowed the council to give the king the power over life and death. Another fatal blow to the African democratic system was allowing the king to raise and maintain his own national army. The national army, as we know, has always been made up of contingents under the supreme command of the council, operating through their respective paramount chiefs and provincial kings. The single change can be said to have completed the triumph of the king of Kuba as an absolute monarch. He had already acquired extraordinary powers. Quite naturally, to the kingdom expanded over new territory. New administrative offices had to be made. Some of these were so important that the king encountered no open opposition when he also appointed them as members of the hitherto exclusive state council. This marked the end of the traditional council as it had functioned under the African Constitution. The court council of the 18 elected states was now outnumbered by appointees to the king. It appears that Shyaam made no display and very little use of his new powers vis-a-vis the elected chiefs. His chief interests continued to be in the field of internal improvement, building a capital city and upgrading the social amenities that reflect a highly advanced society. These included new forms of court etiquette and procedures, resplendent regalia, etc. One of Shyam's stratagems for securing the loyalty and support of important chiefs and other notables was the appointment of their sons to important posts. This move was significant because it bypassed the nephews in favor of the sons, thus satisfying the natural but never spoken desire of most fathers in military society. Now we're talking about the king general. What is the king general? So Shyaam left a record of achievements that none of his successors could match. He was a legend even in his own lifetime. The people had never known or heard of such a leader and had never experienced in their own lives the direct benefits of such leadership. It had to be magic, and therefore Shyaam had to be the great magician, since magic in Africa was simply another religious means of invoking the aid of a deity. To call their chief intercessor with the god a magician meant that he was actually securing benefits for the people, and that he was indeed the lieutenant of God on earth. In short, magic was another form of prayer, song, or dance in the appeals to supernatural powers for help. Mbong Eling, Shyam's successor, was not a great magician. He was a warrior king, a great general. He did not have to carry on the economic revolution. It carried itself on from the momentum Shyaam had given it. Mbong Eliang devoted himself to further wars of conquest and the expansion of the royal power, which these wars made easy. The age-grade military system started by Shyaam was expanded from militia to a strong standing army. Prisoners of war, now slaves, formed the king's personal army. They were stationed in separate villages of their own. Now the king was powerful enough to attempt to make the modest changes in the matrilineal system under Shyaam more thoroughgoing and permanent in the royal family itself. The royal nephews were all placed under permanent house arrest, and sons of kings became heirs to the throne. Meanwhile, they were appointed to important governing parts in different parts of the kingdom. And while it has been suggested that this radical breach of constitutional law was intended to reduce the fractional power struggles in the royal family, what it did was to sharpen such struggles along more clearly defined lines. Mbong had divided not only the royal, but all the chiefs and the people into defenders of the traditional constitution on one hand and the progressive reformers on the other hand. This meant more unrest and more rebellions, right? The king general dealt with these with an iron hand, was successful, and proceeded with another important assault on the Constitution. He outlawed migrations from the country. He outlawed migrations from the country. This had been one of the black man's greatest freedoms, the right of every dissatisfied individual group to withdraw from the community, migrate elsewhere, and either join some other group or set up a new chiefdom. The universal use of this freedom, let it be remembered at every point, is one of the reasons for so many different little societies and language groups throughout the continent, while at the same time indicating a common origin and background. So Mbong just went way against the system. He just rallied all the way against the system on some crazy stuff. Now you can't even leave the country if you're dissatisfied. Mbong, what you doing, man? What are you doing? And so let me go a little further, because what I really want to do is get into make sure I get y'all about these missionaries. Okay, let me find my space so we can get into about these missionaries. I think right here. So we'll start right here. When the 20th century dawned, the dying Kuba was gasping for breath, making its last desperate attempts to free itself from the choking hands it thought had come to bestow Christian blessings. But it was too late. The temporary restoration of the king was too late. The Congo's Free State's gesture of assistance was too late. Death arrived according to schedule, and that was determined by the whites. In 1916, the European-controlled Cote Épée, the last to hold a fictitious title of king to disguise white rule, passed from the scene, and the kingdom of Cuba, having long since died, now had its death certified by the equally small state of Belgium, and now ruled a black region 10 times its size, right? Because the scale of malcontents into slavery did not end the civil strife, because for one thing, all of the rebels were neither captured nor defeated. Besides, the permanent center of conflict was the royal lineage itself. The general upheaval after 1885, the year of European conquest of all Africa began, made it easy for the whites to enter and spread all over the country. The traders and missionaries were the first to take over the country by first allying themselves with the opposing chiefdoms and opposing royal factions, urging on each to keep up the fight against the others. Indeed, the missionaries in Cuba were missionaries of damnation, not salvation. They wore the descriptive garb of religion, but their activities were not only almost wholly political, but were concerned with furthering the disintegration and collapse of this little black nation. They obviously did not come to help, spiritually or otherwise. They came to hinder, at least until the country was completely under white rule. Their next step, therefore, was to actually set up chiefdoms themselves, install puppet chiefs, and rule the country through the chiefdoms over which they had the traders and over which they and the traders had control, right? These missionaries came in under the guise of God. White power in the name of God. They came and they took over. Religion, politics, arms. Religion, politics, and arms, right? Kuba revealed something else. We also saw that there was a black imperialism in Africa, all African without outside influence. Indeed, we saw a microcosm of all the conquests of blacks by blacks, the oppression and enslavement of blacks by blacks, all of which left us the heritage of suspicion, distrust, and hatred that accounts for tribalism, disunity and fear and unrest today. So it would be difficult for us today to trust ourselves because the distrust of blacks against blacks goes back centuries. In spite of it all, the Cuban state was relatively secure as a black power entity until they allowed the whites to come in. At that point, the history of the blacks in Egypt and everywhere else was being repeated in exactly the same way the Maasai said, when the white man shows up, the land will die. The blacks had learned nothing from their previous experiences with whites. The blacks were therefore doomed to repeat the same big mistakes over and over, meanwhile losing both their civilization and their freedom. And that is chapter 9. Chapter 9 of Destruction of Black Civilization. It goes from page 250, it ends on page 258. It ends on page 258. And it starts on page, oh, let me go. It's about 22 to 23 pages in this chapter. From 258 to, okay, from 235 to 258, from pages 235 to 258. If you don't have your copy of the book, link is in the description. My Amazon affiliate link is in the description. You get your copy of the book so you can get caught up. Like this video, comment, subscribe, share this video, hit the super like button, support me on Patreon. Cashapp link is in the PayPal link is in the description. All those different things to support the On the Shoulders of Giants platform as we grow. Because the ultimate goal is the On the Shoulders of Giants educational system, educational center and museum. The On the Shoulders of Giants Educational Center and Museum is one of my ultimate goals. So I need your support to help me get there. And I'm going to do my part to make sure I get there as well, but I do need your help. And I thank everybody who's been supporting me. I got a new patron too. Let me shout out my new patron real quick. Let me open this app up. Shout out my new patron because I appreciate everybody who's been supporting me, but I got to shout out my new patron. I thank Brother Eldridge McLean. I appreciate you. Let me see. Hold on. Some other ones. I think I'm in the wrong spot, but Brother Eldridge McLean, I definitely appreciate you for being a patron. Juanito Wilbon. Yeah. Juanito Wilbon. My man Juanito. My man Juanito right here in Tallahassee, Florida. You're a new patron. I really, 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 really appreciate you. I appreciate everything you do. And I appreciate everything you do for this Tallahassee community. Look, let's continue to learn from this history. We keep repeating this history because we're not learning from it. When we destroy ourselves internally, we will be vulnerable on the outside. That's all I'm going to say about that. Love you all. Make sure y'all catch the next video coming up.